welcome everyone to Intersection, where we have this intersection between faith and practice, faith and theology, practice coming together. I'm here today with my colleague and friend, Randy Harris, and our special guest today, Dr. Chelsie Sargent. Hello, Chelsie. Thanks for joining us today.
Very excited to be here with all of you.
Great to have you on our program again. We keep coming back to Chelsie for wisdom in some of these kinds of spaces. Today, we're going to talk about self-care and the church leader, and feeling like this is a great topic for us as we come to the close of a calendar year, moving toward the holidays, which bring, in some ways, rest and relief, but in other ways can also be a time of shadow as well. And ministers sometimes get sucked into a lot of things at the end of the year. So it's a timely topic. Chelsie is a licensed professional therapist. She has an active practice in Houston, Texas. She's an alumni of ACU and a couple of other institutions, recently finished a doctorate in counseling practice, is well recognized for her work with the Enneagram and with a number of other disciplines, working with people in places of shadow and depression, boundary keeping, and other kinds of areas. She's the wife of a minister and understands quite well the life of church life. It's just a delight to have Chelsie, to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much.
Well, a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome all. Let us know and chat. I see places from various points on the compass popping up on chat here. Thanks for being here. Let us know about where you're from on chat. When we get a little later in the program, we'll want to turn to your questions. So write your questions down in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. That is something that Randy and I will be monitoring, looking for questions to bring to Chelsie as we get into the conversation today. So if something comes to your mind, you think, I want to ask her this question, then put that into the Q&A feature and we'll pick that up and try to work that into our conversation as we get deeper in to our hour today. But as is our practice, let's stop and move into the silence for a moment for a minute of silent prayer, evoking the presence of God who is already present to us in this digital space. And then we'll get into a conversation with Chelsie. Let's pray. O God eternal, you from season to season are timeless and never change. And yet we find ourselves so often in the matrix of up and down in our emotions and our sense of well-being. Use this hour today, we pray, to give us deeper wisdom and inform our practices so that we might live and be present to you in a calm and safe place. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Chelsie, we've said, let's talk about self-care. We use this term, self-care. Help define that for us. What do we mean when we say self-care?
Very simply, the way that I talk about self-care, specifically in my office, is it is the care of your mind, your body, and your soul. And so how do you take care of yourself mentally? How do you take care of your physical self? And then your soul, your spiritual care. What does that look like?
Yeah. And so we're talking about how do we attend to that, right? So what would be talk about that a little more. What would be an example of practicing self-care?
Yeah. So I tell people there's a big difference between treat yourself and self-care. So treating yourself would be some light examples for myself, like going getting my nails done, maybe getting a massage, treating myself to a good cup of coffee. And all of those can be wrapped into self-care, but self-care is hitting deeper levels within yourself that is going to nourish from the inside out. And so even though those things can be incorporated into self-care, self-care may be making sure that you don't sacrifice your workout time throughout the day. Self-care may be having meaningful coffee dates or plans within your month of where you meet with people that feed your soul. Self-care may be guarding an hour a day, an hour a week that you can practice contemplative practices. But both are good, treating yourself and self-care. But I always tell people there's a difference between the two.
So there's this level that you're trying to distinguish between a good cup of coffee and actually attending to the soul. So that seems like that would take a great deal of, I mean, that invites us to be more self-aware. Tell us a little more about how do we practice that kind of reflection about ourselves? What is that? Where does that take us?
You know, one of the curiosities I have in my office after working with people for 20 years is everyone is refueled in different ways. And that takes a lot of self-understanding, experimenting, and knowing how you are refreshed. So what is going to give life and what is going to take life? And things that give me life may not necessarily offer the same thing to the next person. And so that takes understanding yourself, knowing what your needs are, how to meet those needs, how to advocate for those needs. And that's going to take some time to discover about self, and maybe having a professional or someone that you can talk to that can ask good questions and help you discover what is actually life-giving for you.
Yeah. I was thinking about this. You live with a minister. Your husband's a minister. You are involved in congregational life. You're a therapist. You're with people a lot. I'm just wondering, where are the points of where does this what is it that we're trying to attend to when we attend to self? I'm assuming something like, if I said the word anxiety, what do we mean? What do we mean by anxiety, and how does taking care of self attend to something like anxiety?
Yeah, so one of the ways that I break it down, help people kind of think through that piece, is really evaluating the difference between stress and then deeper anxiousness. And those can piggyback off of each other, right? And so understanding how anxiety feels in your body, how anxiety feels in your mind, in your soul, and then being able to differentiate from that, very similar to what you were just saying, of we all have a lot of things on our plate. And you were saying this in the very beginning, specifically this time of year, there's a lot of stress, even though some of it's really good stress. And so knowing how the body manifests stress and how you process through that, and then maybe when the scales are tipping a little bit too far and it's going into more anxious thinking.
So you're defining a sense of the difference between stress, which is a normal part of life, right? But then stress can move to anxiety. Am I following you here? And how do you know when you move from being stressed about something to actually being anxious about something? Talk about this. To me, there's sort of a spectrum you're trying to describe, and there's part of that that's sort of normal, healthy. Yeah, we live in a busy world, but then there comes a point where that moves into something that could become chronic, or it may be acute. It may just hits us, and now we become immobilized, or we become it begins to impact us in unhealthy ways, right? Talk a little more about that.
So one of the things with, and also anxiety is a very normal, natural human feeling too. And it is when the pendulum swings too far to one side and we start having physical and mental manifestations with it. So one of the big things that I talk about with stress is when we live in higher levels of stress for too long, we release cortisol and higher levels of chemicals that starts having effect on our body, very similar to what anxiety is going to do to our body. So we will start having physical symptoms with heart palpitations, and anxiousness can also bring that in. Hives, hair loss, weight gain, different things that packing in those extra chemicals can start causing a lot of stress on the physical body. And anxiety can also bring that in. The difference, what I say, is as stress is going to really start affecting you physically, when it starts swinging into anxiety is where ruminating thoughts, of where you can't get out of the hamster loop of thinking over the same thing, obsessive thinking, intrusive thoughts that make no sense or that you wouldn't normally think, or all of a sudden in your brain, you're like, I have no idea where that came from, or I was not worried about that earlier, and now I'm really obsessing and ruminating on it. And then again, also the physical manifestations. And I could sit here and probably spend all session talking about all the physical manifestations of anxiety, because there's a lot, but they can mask itself just like stress. So again, they hold hands, but there are definitely some differences.
Yeah.
Isn't ministry an inherently anxious activity? I mean, stress, everybody works hard, and not everything goes perfectly in anybody's job, but there's an anxiety that goes with the care of souls, and it just seems like anxiety is going to be part of you better figure out what you're going to do with it, because it's going to be part of the kind of standard operating stuff. What do you think? Or
I would agree with that, because I put ministers kind of in the same circle as helpers. And I think anyone who's in helping professions, they're taking on a different layer of stress that can tip over into anxiousness. Because, one of the things that my clients ask me a lot, oftentimes, is, you must carry this with you, or do you think about your work outside of your office? And the answer to that is yes, I do. I definitely have some practices that I implement daily of where I try to leave my work in my office, but I carry stories inside my heart and my brain from what I do. And I think ministers are very similar in that, because they're in the work of people and souls, like you said.
Yeah. Well,
and I'm thinking, in ministry, there are some very life-giving experiences, and then there are some life-sucking activities. And you don't have the luxury of saying, okay, I'm not going to do the life-sucking ones, because they're part of your job. You have to. So what are we doing? Are we looking for balance to make sure that we have life-giving coming in at the same proportion that life-sucking is going? Because you can't, you may be in a period where preaching isn't very pleasurable to you, and you can't decide, okay, I'm just not going to do that for a while. That you don't have the option of that.
Yeah. And I think that hits on a good point, is just because something for self-care works for me right now, I change as a human being. And so I may need to evolve with that down the road as my career evolves, as my interests evolves, and as pressure. So I think that is, again, floating back up to the understanding of yourself, is as you are traversing different parts of your career, different parts of your ministry, that you are going to have to care for yourself differently. The hope would be is that maybe some of that joy and life-giving would come back to preaching, and maybe that can be sought through a different kind of self-care for yourself.
Yeah.
But you have to understand that and address that and care for that part, instead of just hoping that it's going to go away, or I'm just going to muscle through this part, because then we can lead into all things about burnout and compassion fatigue, which, again, I could spend whole hours talking on those things as well.
Good. You mentioned what we're beginning to kind of move toward it a little bit is, how do we attend to this? And you mentioned a moment ago that once you leave your office, there are certain practices that you try to do to kind of leave things in place. What might some of those be? I'm wondering if there'd be anything that ministers might find of use.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do before I leave my office, and I got this from a good friend of mine, is I take a moment to release all the stories that I've heard that day. And I do it twofold. I do it very purposefully with something physical that I do. And what I do in my office is I have a bowl that I put marbles in, and I drop a marble in it of every person who has sat with me that day. And it's this physical moment before I walk out of my office, is I'm releasing this out of me right now. And my bowl is actual hands. And whether I talk about God or not in my office, I believe that I am joining the work that God is already doing. And so I'm releasing it into God's hands. And I'm not going to carry that. And then I'm also hearing the marbles as they drop into the jar. So there's this physical sense. I'm touching the marbles, I'm hearing the marbles. And then I'm also, with my soul, my mind, I'm letting them go. And so that's one, just, and that's, we could also like put that into a contemplative practice, a mindful practice. And then when I leave my office and things pop in my head, I just really, going back to the mind, I really try to say that's not for right now. I have places in my day of where I can think about that, give myself permission to let that go. But again, that takes just a lot of awareness and me being aware that my mind is, oh, I've been thinking about that for the last 5 minutes, instead of tuning in to what my family member is saying to me right now.
Right. That's good. Part of what you're suggesting there makes me think about creating boundaries, right? You're creating a boundary. At the end of the day, you're letting go of something so that you can attend to other parts of your life, right? Boundary setting would be an important thing for us to consider in self-care. Yes? Talk to us about boundaries.
So you have internal boundaries and external boundaries. So the internal boundaries is what I'm keeping for myself, boundaries that I'm not going to cross. And then you have external boundaries that I'm putting around my environment. And there's some nuances in that, but let me explain. So internal boundaries, a good example of that is boundaries that I'm going to internally set with how I spend my time. And so when am I working? When am I resting? And when am I playing? And those things, because we all have so many things on our plate, are not going to come naturally. And I've learned the older that I get, I actually have to schedule out all those things. They're not just going to happen. And so those are internal boundaries, schedules that I keep with myself. And external boundaries, the things that I put around other people, my technology devices, things that also require my time. And so one of the things, because, you know, with my husband's work, life, the ministry, and my own work, life as a therapist, I say no a lot to people when it comes to where I spend my time outside of family or my office, because I know how expensive, emotionally and mentally expensive, the work is that we do day in and day out. And early on, I would get a pushback of like, man, you say no a lot. And I'm like, yes, but the things that I say yes to, I get to be all in on, because I want to be doing it and my energy gets to go there.
Yeah. It can be a little challenging, I think, for ministers to say no. Talk a little bit about how thinking about, although ministers need to learn to say no too. I want to be sure I say that. But talk a little more about setting boundaries for the course of a day. How would it be good to have sort of a rhythm to a day, and as best you can to kind of live in a set of practices or rhythms or boundaries to attend to the life of a day? Again, ministers are often get interrupted, and yet if there's no rhythm in the day to start with, what do you go back to, right? But talk about how would structuring a day matter for self-care?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about structuring your day, and sometimes this seems overwhelming. So one of the caveat that I want to give to this is you can start very, very small to the expansive list that I'm about to give you. So what I tell people is the goal is that your working days are very structured. For as much as you can, you are going to keep rhythms throughout your day. That is that, like, maybe right when you get to the office, That is where you're going to have time to shut your door. You've gone over with your staff and people around you that, hey, my office is going to stay shut for the first hour. And here's the only things that you can interrupt me for. Or just kind of having those conversations with people around you, because then you're also kind of setting that external boundary. The internal boundary of this is the hour that I'm going to feed myself. And the external boundaries, I've set the expectations for those around me. And you can encourage your staff and people around you to do the same. And in that hour, being able to feed your soul, read, pray, journal, meet with your spiritual director, things that I'll talk about that later on in our discussion today, but things that are pouring into your cup. Because you were exactly right. Because I've been in this work with my husband for nearly 20 years. Is when he gets home in the evening, there's probably about 4 or 5 things that he had not planned on throughout the day, and that's probably a light number that of what he engaged with that he had no clue he was going to be doing when he walked out of the house that day. But I do know that he fiercely protects a portion of his day at the beginning so he can give from a full cup versus a cup that's only half full or has not been attended to.
Yeah, it's good.
That does make me wonder if a colleague and I went through a period of time where we decided that we were just overscheduled. It was getting to the point where there was not room for divine interruptions. And you know, I'll put you on my calendar 2 weeks from Tuesday, which was just unacceptable. And so we both agreed we just need to schedule less. There has to be room in the day for those interruptions. And I'm wondering if that's possible for ministers, just to be disciplined in their scheduling, but not schedule every minute of every day where every interruption is adds to your anxiety.
And I think you used a really good word, is the difference between schedule and structure. So my day being structured, and here is where I'm going to hold some boundaries and have these portions of my day. But I love that word that you just used of being able to have divine interruptions. And you are, again, knowing yourself and your schedule, being able to leave space for that. And so that's what and I'm sure y'all have all kind of seen those examples of the marble jar. There's like a big rubber ball. And if you put all the marbles in the jar and you try to put the big rubber ball in first, it won't go all the way in. But if you put the rubber ball in first, and all the marbles form around that rubber ball. And so that's a little bit of what we're talking about right now, is what's the rubber ball? Like, what's the thing that how you are caring for yourself so things can structure around it. So structure and schedule, I think that's a good differentiation.
Let's talk about a rubber ball here. What matters? I'll just say it this way. What are the spiritual practices that we might engage in that helps cares for us, that really nurtures us? What would be some things that we could start talking about that needs to hit the jar every day, or and we could talk about the jar every week or every month, but we're back to rhythms here. But let's talk about the marble. Let's talk about the rubber ball. What are the things that perhaps ministers ought to be doing or considering? What have you seen in your experience as you work with people? What matters to shape the spiritual life?
So one of the things that I tell people, and this is a formula that you can use, is daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Mm-hmm. And what you can start doing with that formula is, what are the ways that I care for myself daily? What is something a little bit bigger that I'm going to do for myself weekly? What is something a little bit bigger that I'm going to do for myself monthly? And this is usually like significant time off work. What's the one thing a year that I'm going to protect and give time to? And so the daily pieces, those are practicing your hobbies. I hope you have hobbies and things that you love outside of ministry in your family, and things that are just for you. I have some really quirky ones that I engage with and love that bring me such joy. And that's some things that I work with people in my office trying to discover about themselves. And so I do that daily with some of those hobbies. I also move my body daily. And so I'm not, because I sit all day. I think a lot of ministers sit a lot of their time too with people or in their office writing sermons. And so my body, my brain needs that movement. Weekly, I try to make sure that I'm meeting with someone who feeds my soul once a week, whether that be my own spiritual director that I've had at times, or a really good friend that can pour into my soul. And then something a little bit bigger once a month. And that can be a variety of things, like a small little weekend trip, an overnight getaway, a special dinner that you're reserving with someone that you love, that cares for you. Maybe scheduling out several hours in an afternoon that you're going to go spend at a bookstore and not read for your sermon and enjoy a good cup of coffee while you're doing something else. And then yearly, if you are not taking every single day of your vacation time every year, I highly recommend that you reevaluate that and make sure that all of that is being exhausted by December 31st.
Right. Recently, Randy and I had a conversation with a couple of spiritual directors, Jackie Halstead, Eric Wilson. We were talking about the role of spiritual direction, and you're mentioning it here again. What is it about having a spiritual director or having a good friend that you can open your heart to? Talk about how that attends to the self. What's going on in that becomes valuable?
So there's three things that I can break that down into. And so you said one, talking with a friend and a spiritual director. And then the third one that I would put on that is having a group of ministers that you meet with regularly.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's good.
So the meeting with a friend is, man, I can just, in a really good way, just be myself. And I can talk about the things that are heavy on me. I can get good feedback, and a friend who's like, yes, and can see that and be with me with what I'm talking about, going through, hurting with, or my joys. Mm-hmm. Spiritual director, I like the way that Steve my husband always talks about that, is someone who's just listening to God on your behalf. Mm-hmm. Someone who's taking time and space and asking you good questions about God and your spiritual life, and kind of bringing you into that space that someone's checking up on you spiritually, because you were spending so much time doing that for others and tending to others' soul. Do you have that in your life? Mm-hmm. And then meeting with a group of ministers who get it. Mm-hmm. I mean, y'all are like, I have a group of counselors that I meet with. We are speaking our own language every time that we talk. And we're talking about things that can just be shared in our group. And so ministers having that too, where they don't feel so isolated and alone, and they just get it.
That's good. That's good. I really like the triangle that you've created with those 3 points and the ways in which they speak to different aspects of who we are, and particularly thinking about ministers. That's really good. That's really good. Randy, go ahead.
Well, I'm sort of paying attention to some of the question and answers. So let me rephrase one of the questions. Okay, what if none of this works? How do you feel about modern medicine? That there may be times when we need a pill, and can we destigmatize? Those medicines address a need, I assume, in the same way that other medicines address physical needs. So how do you know when it's a time for some modern medicine in addition? How do you know when some just better self-care is the answer, and when you might need some additional help?
So I tell my clients, when you come in, I am a lifeboat, and I'm hanging out in the ocean with you, and I have all of these life preservers in my boat with me, and I'm going to toss as many life preservers as I can, and tools, and to address whatever we're talking about. And the hope is that my client, my person, can hook their arms over the life preservers and pop their head above water long enough to get enough oxygen in their lungs that they can keep. They get strong enough, they use all the tools, and their mouth, their head stays above water. Sometimes the head just can't come above the water, and there is chemical imbalance and something that they need that's more than just these tools. And they need to go speak with their psychiatrist, their doctor, and talk about some medical interventions. It's very similar to if I were to walk into a doctor's office and they're like, "Hey, Chelsie, you have diabetes." I'm just not going to say, "Okay, great," and walk out of the office and be like, "Well, what do I need to do? How do I bring my body back into balance?" And that's exactly what the medication does, is we're bringing your body back into balance, because once you do that, all those life preservers, they look different. They help out differently. And you really have to ask yourself, how much is this disrupting quality of life? And if the answer is, after you've tried all these things, it still is, then having expanded conversations with those who can help.
And I assume that we'd want to take the stigma off of that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with getting medical help.
Nothing.
When you need it.
Nothing. And that's the way to say it, is it's medical help and health. I know that it's mental health and it's wrapped into that, but yes. And that has grown so much, specifically in the last 5 to 10 years, and we still have a long way to go. But I relate it to the same as just like all the other medical interventions.
Well, there's a lot of stigma about medical help or even seeing a therapist, right? We're making progress in these spaces, but again, our goal here is care and holistic care. Hey, to all of you who are viewing, love to hear questions. We've got a question or two that's popped in already, but this is a good point for me to say, if you've got a question for Chelsie that's emerged for you as we've heard this conversation, then take a moment and pop over to the Q&A and write it out for us, and we'll pick up on it here as we go a little further. One thing that occurs to me, Chelsie, is that for many people in ministry, we talked a little bit about boundaries, but one the work of ministry can be so expansive. It creeps into your weekends, it creeps into times off, it creeps into your evenings. I want to talk a little bit about family. How do you pay attention to your spouse, to children, to other family needs? We talked a little bit about taking care of yourself, having a time to spend with a spiritual director, or having an hour in the day where you're praying or reading for the sake of reading. But talk to us a little bit about family life and ministry and boundaries that help nurture good family life. I know that you and Steve have to wrestle with that, and you see it in your practice. Talk to us a little bit about family.
So one of the things specifically, we're going to talk about your partner, your spouse, the person who's kind of journeying along with you, to also have a good discussion with them about what they need for self-care and how they care for themselves. Because like I was describing earlier, y'all may need very different things for self-care. And so y'all may have to do some negotiating or some really active planning of how you're going to do that within your house, the boundaries and protecting alone time. I tell people within and this is an example of what works for us, I know every family is different, is we really protect dinner time. We don't have any technology around our dinner table, that at least a good 3-4 nights out of the week, we're sitting down and eating dinner face to face and having conversation and asking good questions. And we definitely do movie nights and stuff like that in front of the TV with pizza. So it's not, again, all or nothing, but that we really try to make sure that we carve out that time, and we will say no to a lot of things so we can be home and do that as a family. So that's one of the ways. How you use technology in your house, that's a big thing that I talk about, I speak on. It's not just for kids and teens and how to do that, it's for adults too. And so realizing that I can be answering emails at 9 o'clock at night and to clients, but knowing that having different guards on my phone or different things that I can set that aside so I'm not on 24 hours a day. And so for ministers, doing that as well. And you may need to set that precedence with your board, your elders, your staff, so you can do that. And then recognizing with your family what gives y'all life. Is that protecting Saturday mornings and y'all getting out in nature together? Is that no sports? You're not doing sports games and all those kinds of things. That's the other thing that you're contending with, is the schedule of your family as well. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you can't do huge chunks of time, but can you protect an hour? And that is something, talking about structure and rhythms, that's rhythms within your schedule. And I see families do that in a million different ways, creative ways.
Yeah, it's good. One other question that occurs to me that I don't think we've addressed yet, but this is coming to be more and more a thing that we see in the Siburt Institute, ministers asking about Sabbath and Sabbath practices. So we've recently released a guide to sabbatical policies, for example, out of the Siburt Institute. But what would you say about taking a day off? Or I'm thinking about you talked about it daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly. When I talk about a sabbatical policy, I'm talking about 6 weeks or 2 months periodically where a minister might take a leave to do renewal work. But Sabbath can be something as simple as a day. But talk about Sabbath keeping and Sabbath practices. How might that be useful? I assume that's useful, right? That's helpful. That's renewing. How would that play into self-care?
I mean, one of the, Steve gets every Friday off because Sunday's a work day, and many ministers that I've worked with and heard of do get some day off during the week. And again, just really structuring that day and not overscheduling it, but knowing that you're going to have something that you do in the morning that's going to be life-giving. Maybe you're going to engage in your hobby during that day. Until, as much as you can, don't see church people on that day. And so that you're, again, just getting a break from the work that you do. And that's what, for my elders or church members, of like, hey, your minister's a person too, and they need a break. And that has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with that they are a better person, a better minister, when they get that Sabbath and that break from the church. And that's a super complicated part of the life of a minister, because so many of your friends are also wrapped into your church and the people that you're around. And so I know that you can't go to Target and buy friends. And so I know this next thing is complicated, but as much as you can, make friends outside of church. And that can be through your hobbies. That can be through different things that you're engaging with outside of the church, but you have to engage with things outside of your work, which means you're going to have to create space for that. Right. And Sabbath can be that. Now, I've talked a lot about doing, and Sabbath, when a word that's used with that, is rest. And so on that day off, allowing yourself to authentically rest. And what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And that can be as simple as a good nap. That can be as simple as just sitting out in your front yard if you don't live in Texas, because it's too hot here sometimes, and just being and listening to nature, listening to something besides technology. But something that just lets your body, your nervous system, calm down for a bit.
That's good. That's good. Thank you for that. Hey, again, asking for questions. I see one question here that I would raise. I think this is coming from someone who's a spouse of a minister, asking if I'm a wife, I'm married to a minister, I've got a career away from the church, how do I find mental energy to serve the church well? Also, this speaks deeply into your world. I think, Chelsie, is a spouse of a minister, and you kind of addressed some of that earlier about not always being having the same need for the same kinds of practices. But what about a spouse who has a career outside of the life of a congregation? What about self-care for that person? What would you say to that?
What a great question. I think one of the things that I encourage my ministry spouses is what is life-giving within the life of the church for you? And where do you feel alive, or your gifts are used? Or really good advice that I got early on in ministry with Steve, and again, this worked for us, I know it's not for everyone, is someone told me, don't do a whole lot the first year you're there. Just observe and see how the church works. And then you can decide where you want to put energy towards. And what specifically, because I had a career outside of the church and a lot of my energy was going elsewhere. So when I did show up for these events, or I put on an event, or I was engaging in something, I had energy for it because it was something that I decided that I wanted to do, or that I felt giftedness in, or because I had said no to a lot of other things. Like I was saying earlier, that I could give a lot of energy to this one thing. The thing about that is you're most likely going to get pushback, or people say things. And that is that not over identifying with other people, that is their own stuff. And that you and your spouse, and maybe that's also a boundary or something that is set with other leaders within the church, of here's how we're protecting our time, because we show up as our better selves and have more to give.
Yeah, that's good.
So we have another question that I feel like has to do just with the complications of church relations. Used to, people who went into ministry would preach right up till the day they died. And part of that was financial, and part of it was other things. There are more mid-career people saying, I don't think I can do this anymore. There are fewer young people saying, I think I want to do this for my career. And a lot of that just does seem to have to do with a profession where the demands and expectations are very high. And leaders want to care for their minister, and they're also their boss. And everybody has an opinion about how you're doing. And your failings are on full display every week. How do we have spiritually healthy ministers for the long haul? The relationship seems inherently complex.
Mm-hmm. Good question. And I can respond to it because I don't have a lot of answers to it, but I'll respond to some of those things that you just asked. And I think that you also tapped into something that needs to be talked about too, is we're looking at the whole system and how the whole system has been structured, and is the system evolving as we evolve and we know more about humans, about how to care for ourselves. And so when I'm working with elderships and boards, and that's a big thing that I'm working on with them, is your own spiritual care, your own spiritual health, your own self-care health. And are y'all healthy as a group? Because that's going to trickle down to staff and ministers, and that you can help them. Like, again, you're pouring out of a cup that is fuller, and you can help them advocate for them to fill their cup. That's why I tell a lot of elderships and boards, make sure that you have a sabbatical policy for your ministers in there. Maybe even kind of talking like, hey, you get a day off in the week. How can we help you use that day off that's just for you? So we help you protect that. So you're doing it as a team. And the minister is not just left out there trying to advocate and do all this thing for themselves. And that's, I think that's a big differentiation, as I've seen kind of the church evolve over at least my time within it, of how can this be more of a group effort instead of just one person. I think another piece of it is also learning the difference between burnout and compassion fatigue. And those are, I don't have a ton of time to go into that, but the burnout being more just getting really tired of what you're doing, a lot of physical manifestations, cynicism, a lot of those things coming in, and compassion fatigue is you have served at such a high level energy of caring that you have nothing else to give because you have not taken care of yourself and filled the cup back up. And so a lot of ministers leave on that piece too. And it's a Venn diagram because many things overlap with compassion fatigue and burnout of how it manifests. But that's also something I help a lot of people differentiate between too. Is this burnout? You're just really tired of what you're doing and you need like physical rest and time away? Or have you served at such a high capacity that you're having a hard time having compassion for people anymore? And so making sure that you have a whole team yourself, whether that be spiritual director, counselor, good friends in and outside of the church, your own self-care structure and plan, taking your vacation time, connecting with your family, guarding that time. I mean, this is a complex system that we're looking at. It's not just one thing. That's why I was saying at the very beginning, like I can have a massage once a week and that's great. And that is one teeny tiny piece in a structure that I've got to be also really aware of.
Yeah, I was thinking one writer, a friend of mine who's written on resilience in ministry, he calls it a constellation, a constellation of relationships
I love that.
and practices that need to set around the minister, the minister's family, that attend to this. He's working up frameworks of resilience, which is akin to this, right? It's adjacent to this.
Yeah.
What you're describing. That's good.
Yeah.
Another question that's come in here is from one of our viewers who works as a children's minister. She says, you know, I get so few opportunities. I never get to hear a sermon. I'm always running hither and thither and yon. Not many opportunities to even be in a Bible study. I'm always trying to help volunteers find things for the kids, et cetera, et cetera. How do I maintain spiritual health? Where the frenetic pace of ministry sort of outstrips things. What would you say to our viewer here? What does that evoke for you as you think about self-care?
That's a great question. That maybe also just a tiny reframe of where am I going to get fed spiritually outside of the church? And that's okay. Mm-hmm. And so that maybe that's not the place during certain seasons or times of where that's going to come because of your own schedule of feeding other souls. Mm-hmm. And so that's where having that mindfulness of where are you going to pursue that in Sabbath with a spiritual director, with your own contemplative practices. And because of technology, there's so many different things that we have access to of where we can put that in our day. But again, when we're talking about structure, like that first hour of the day, again, I know that's not going to work for everyone. It can be your last hour of the workday. Again, that's just a very loose example. But that may be the thing that you're like, okay, that's not going to come naturally in my day-to-day kind of work with the church. And so where am I going to have that internal boundary that I'm going to make sure that I'm exposing myself to that? And that's the thing is like, some people make this sound like it's just all so natural and it should just kind of be there. Like this is actually really deep, hard soul work. And it's very purposeful work to know and understand yourself and how to care for yourself.
So yeah, if you're able to get that on Sunday, then I've got to be very intentional about creating other times and spaces to attend to my own soul care, right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Good. Well, Chelsie, there's one coming in that's using Enneagram language, so I'm going to just go right at it.
Deal.
This question says, look, I'm an Enneagram 2. And identifying good soul care has been elusive. And then, of course, all of life's circumstances around that, being married, you got kids, et cetera, lots of frenetic activity in the life. How do I find practical rhythms of discovering my own needs as they change and flow through all of that? What would you say to an Enneagram 2 with regard to soul care? I'm asking that way because I know that you'll pick up on that and play with that a little bit.
So I'm assuming that some people that are listening know the Enneagram, or at least have been exposed to it. So I am going to talk just a second about the Enneagram, all the numbers, and this can tap into kind of thinking through these three entities. Some of this is based out of Chris Hewart's work, and I really like this. And he talks about the three different practices on the triads for the Enneagram: silence, solitude, and stillness. And so the 8, the 9, and the 1, which are our doers, their spiritual practice to lean into is stillness, to not do, just to be. And then for the 2, the 3, and the 4, it's solitude. And the 2 spend so much time doing for others, serving others, giving of themselves to others. And so where are they spending time in silence, in solitude, by themselves?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big, big piece. And then the 5, the 6, and the 7, it's stillness. Stillness of the brain, stillness of the body. I mean, sorry, not stillness. It's silence of the brain, silence of their just being silent and not having to have all the noise around them or noise within their head. And those, again, they're called disciplines for a reason, that it takes a lot of time and effort and knowing yourself of how to do that piece. Because I have no problem being by myself and having nothing on and being totally silent. It's the doing part, because I'm in a doing triad and I'm going to be a doer first. And so just sitting and being, that's pretty excruciating for me sometimes, which knows that, but when I do it, I have different kind of energy. So for the 2, it's the solitude, spending authentic. So maybe researching what authentic solitude is and then playing around with some solitude practices for yourself.
Sure. That's good. That's good. Thank you for that. Thanks for that. Wow, what a rich conversation today. So many good things. Inviting our viewers as we come to the end of the calendar year to be attending to what are the practices that we engage in? How do we set boundaries internally, externally? You've named a whole plethora of things for us to consider today, Chelsie. As we wrap up, I'm going to start moving us toward a conclusion. I would like to ask Chelsie and Randy, and I'll ask Randy first, but as you think about and reflect about our conversation today, what are one or two, what would be the one thing that really stands out to you that you'd want to reinforce as we think about self-care and the practice of ministry? What would be the thing to leave our viewers with? So let me just ask Randy, what would that be for you as you reflect about our conversation today?
I think it is really easy to fall into the immediate and the urgent, and we really have to think about the long haul. How are you going to do this tomorrow and next week and next year and rhythm, structure, whatever words you want to use to that, creating a rule of life that's going to sustain you for the long haul, and having some discipline about that. And there'll be times where you'll have to flex on it, but at least you've got something you're flexing from. You're not just spasming all the time to whatever's coming in. So I think taking that, I want to be healthy for what are the practices that make me healthy for the long haul? Because I want to serve these people, not just today, but tomorrow, next week, and next year.
Yeah, and stay relatively sane while doing it. Yeah. Thanks, Randy. That's great. Chelsie, as you reflect about our conversation this hour, what stands out to you? What would you want to leave our viewers with today?
So one of the three-legged stool for my project for my doctorate that I spent a lot of time in was self-care. That was one of the big things that I researched and thought about and looked for peer-reviewed data on. And here's the biggest thing that I came back with self-care is specifically in mental health. We don't have enough research on it, and it's so subjective, because what works for me is not going to work for you, most likely. There will be differences. And so that takes just a higher level of self-understanding. So also using tools that help you understand yourself, which several have been talked about here, but to really know that this is going to be a collective effort. I hope everyone's taking care of themselves, and then unique to how that care is going to play out for you.
Mm-hmm. What you're saying speaks to a lot of intentionality, right, on our part, to pay attention to ourselves and ask the hard questions.
Yes.
And be curious, practice. Yeah, that's good. Beautiful. Chelsie, thank you for your time today. What a joy to be with you again and to talk about these things. It's a great joy to have you on this program, to be on Intersection, and this has been good, wise, and helpful as we end the calendar year, thinking about self-care. Thank you. And to our viewers, thank you for being a part of our conversations today. This wraps up the calendar year for us. We do have a slate for the spring for Intersection. Our next guest is on January the 16th. Dr. Doug Peters will be with us. We're going to be talking about renewal and replanting of congregations. Doug is the director for Heritage 21. We want to talk a little bit about that organization and the work they're doing with congregations across the country. So look for notice about that, but mark January 16th, that Tuesday, for our next Intersection event. And want to say thank you to Renee, to Olame, who've been helping us today with production. And again, to all of you who participated today, wishing you a happy and holy Advent and Christmas season as we move toward the end of the calendar year. Randy, would you bless us and send us on our way today?
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.